On my 72nd birthday, my son invited me on a cruise. I thought it meant he still loved me. But on the second night, a waitress slipped me a napkin under the table. It said, "Call 911. There is something in your tea." My hands went cold. My own son. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that I misunderstood. But deep down, I knew. So what do you do when the person you gave life to decides yours has no value left? On the morning of my 72nd birthday, I found a small envelope under my door. No card, no handwriting, just a printed note that said, "Pack warm. Boat leaves Friday at 10 a.m. It was from Darren. I hadn't heard from my son in almost 4 years. Not a phone call, not a holiday message, not even when my blood pressure landed me in the ER last winter. So when I saw that note, I didn't know whether to feel joy or dread. I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, just staring at it. The coffee had gone cold. The toast was untouched. All I could think was, why now? But maybe, just maybe, he had changed. 2 days later, I stood on the pier in Annapolis, clutching a scarf and trying not to overthink. The cruise ship Darren booked looked modest, not the flashy kind. A local line, cozy, a few families boarding. And there he was, my son, waiting with that old smile I hadn't seen since his wedding. Liana stood beside him, polished and poised. She gave me a half hug, the kind you give to someone you're being polite to. The room they had prepared for me was surprisingly lovely. Soft blankets, a framed photo of us from a long time ago, even a small bookshelf with my favorite titles. It felt thought out, as if someone had asked about me, remembered what I loved. That night at dinner, they sat on either side of me. Liana poured me a cup of chamomile tea before I could reach for water. Darren cut my salmon for me like I was fragile. It was sweet, but strange. I wasn't used to being tended to, and certainly not by them. They asked about my bookstore, the monthly readings I still hosted for the senior group, even the volunteer nights I did at the literacy center. They were listening, or at least pretending well. Darren even laughed at my joke about our town's mayor getting caught reading romance novels in the non-fiction aisle. Later, as I looked out over the water from my cabin, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Maybe peace, maybe hope. I knew better than to trust too quickly, but still, it felt like Darren was trying. I wanted to believe this trip meant something. But for those of you who've lived long enough, you know what I mean when I say that sometimes silence has an edge, the kind that doesn't make noise, but slices through the air anyway. I couldn't name it that night, but something inside me stayed alert. And sometimes it's the calmest moments that come right before the storm. Let me take you back to the second night. That was when the tea turned bitter. That was when everything started to unravel. And that was when I learned this birthday trip wasn't about me at all. Not really. The morning air on the second day was crisp, and the water outside my cabin window looked like glass. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was excited, but because my body felt oddly heavy. There was a strange tightness in my chest, and my hands tingled when I tried to grip the edge of the sink. I blamed it on the sea air and age. A little stretching, I told myself. Maybe I had slept wrong. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, fewer people, more intimate. Darren wasn't there, but Liana greeted me with a bright smile and guided me to a table by the window. She handed me a steaming mug, said it was a blend she picked up in Charleston. Good for stress, smelled faintly of mint and something earthy. I took a few polite sips. After just half a cup, my head felt cloudy. Not spinning, not quite dizzy, just fogged, like someone had turned the dimmer switch on my brain. I blinked a few times and focused on Liana, who was talking about how cruises helped people reconnect. She smiled a lot, used my first name more than usual, said things like, "You deserve to be pampered. You've given your whole life to others." Her words landed soft, but something about them felt rehearsed. She asked about my medications, wanted to know if I still took the little blue pills for my blood pressure. I nodded slowly, pretending not to notice the way her eyes flicked toward her phone as she typed something. Later that afternoon, we all went up to the top deck. The breeze helped clear my head, but the fatigue clung to me like wet wool. I leaned on the railing and watched the coastline drift. Darren handed me a glass of lemonade. It tasted slightly off. Not bad, just not right. I set it down and said I'd rather have water. Liana quickly jumped in, offering me a chilled bottle from her tote bag. That night, dinner was served in the captain's lounge. Candlelight, soft music, and some seafood dish I couldn't pronounce. My appetite was thin. I picked at the food while Darren recounted stories from his new business venture, something about crypto software. I nodded along, though most of it flew over me. When dessert came, Liana reached for the teapot again. "A different blend," she said. "Lavender and chamomile. Helps with digestion." I let her pour it, watched her stir in a splash of honey, then slide the cup toward me like it was something sacred. Her tone never changed, but her eyes never left the cup. I held it for a moment. The ceramic was warm against my fingers. I brought it close, pretended to take a sip, then set it down. She smiled. Back in my room, the cloudiness returned, worse this time. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart fluttering like a weak moth against a window. My stomach cramped once, then again. I lay down and closed my eyes, trying to breathe through it. It passed after a while, but a low hum of unease stayed behind. I stood and walked to the mirror. My face looked pale. Not sick, exactly, but not quite me. I noticed a small tremor in my right hand as I brushed a strand of hair back. I didn't remember shaking before this trip. The wind picked up outside, the curtains swayed, and somewhere down the corridor, a door clicked shut. That night, I barely slept. My mind wandered in and out of strange half-dreams. All the while, a quiet question lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to settle. By sunrise, I knew something was wrong, but I also knew I had to keep pretending it wasn't. Not yet. Dinner on the third night was quieter. The tables were arranged in a semicircle around a small piano, where a young man played slow jazz. Most passengers had already grown familiar with one another, sharing stories over drinks and desserts. I kept to myself, watching the flicker of candlelight catch in the glassware. Liana and Darren arrived late. She kissed me on the cheek and whispered that I looked well rested. Darren sat down heavily, rubbing his temples and muttering something about the motion of the waves. I smiled politely and said nothing. The waiter came around, offering a house specialty. I declined the wine. Liana insisted I try her ginger pear spritzer instead. I let her pour it into my glass and watched the liquid bubble slightly before settling flat. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to the restroom. Not because I needed to go, but because the fog in my head had returned and I needed space. The hallway outside the dining room was dim, lined with framed photos of famous ships and newspaper clippings from past voyages. As I walked back toward my seat, something caught my attention. A young waitress, probably no older than 22, stood at the edge of the room near the service cart. She was folding napkins quickly, but her eyes followed Liana across the room. When I passed her, she looked directly at me. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as I reached my chair, I found something strange. Tucked just beneath my folded napkin was a small piece of paper. No envelope, no name, just a torn edge and a few shaky words in pen. Call 911. There is something in your tea. My throat tightened. For a moment I thought my heart had stopped. I blinked and read it again, slower this time. The handwriting was rushed, the ink slightly smeared. I looked around, calmly, slowly. No one was watching me. I slid the paper into my purse and folded the napkin over the plate like nothing had happened. My hands trembled beneath the table. Not from age, from fear. I didn't touch the spritzer again. Darren didn't notice. He was busy checking his phone. Liana asked if I was feeling cold. I nodded. She smiled and ordered me another tea. The moment the waiter set the cup down, I could smell it. Familiar, but wrong. Chamomile mixed with something slightly metallic, almost sweet, like wilted flowers and copper. I thanked him, let it sit untouched, and continued to play along. Later, in my cabin, I locked the door and sat at the desk under the small reading lamp. I pulled the note from my purse and read it again. This time, I allowed myself to feel the panic. My head pounded with questions, but my instincts were louder. Someone had noticed. Someone had warned me. I replayed the dinner in my mind. The way Liana kept touching my glass. The way Darren barely looked at me unless he was speaking. The way they always knew where I was, what I was drinking, when I went to bed. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt organized, rehearsed. I didn't sleep that night. I listened to the hum of the engine beneath the floor, to the creak of metal expanding against salt air. At one point, I heard footsteps outside my door, a soft knock, then nothing. Morning came too slowly. My eyes were sore, and the nausea was back, heavier this time. But I got dressed, brushed my hair, and pinned on my brooch like nothing had changed. At breakfast, I saw the waitress again. She passed my table quickly, then paused. As she poured coffee into the cup of the man beside me, she turned her wrist slightly, revealing a tiny mark in pen near the crease of her thumb. It was a phone number, local area code. She didn't say a word, but her eyes met mine, and I knew then, with terrifying clarity. I wasn't imagining any of it. The next morning, I didn't go to breakfast. Instead, I sat quietly on the small balcony attached to my cabin, wrapped in a cardigan, watching the fog roll over the water like slow breath. My hands were still trembling. The note from the night before rested on the table beside me, folded once, but already worn at the edges from how many times I had opened and closed it. I hadn't slept. Not really. My eyes had shut for minutes at a time, but my body refused rest. I kept listening for footsteps, for doors, for any shift in the hallway outside. But it was the silence that did more damage. The quiet made my thoughts louder. I kept replaying the moments from the dining room, from earlier that week. Every smile from Liana, every glass of tea she poured, every time Darren offered to walk me back to my room. I had ignored too many things, and now I couldn't afford to ignore anything else. Just before 10, I left my cabin and made my way slowly toward the mid-deck cafe. I didn't want to go back to the formal dining room, too exposed, too watched. The cafe was smaller, self-serve, with passengers mostly keeping to themselves. I grabbed a cup of black coffee and sat in the far corner, facing the door. It didn't take long. The same waitress from the night before walked in with a tray of pastries. She glanced toward the seating area, saw me, then made her way to the table closest to mine. She adjusted a napkin, cleared a few crumbs, then leaned slightly in my direction. She spoke low and fast. I only caught part of it. She said she was in school for pharmacology. that she'd seen my daughter-in-law adding something to my cup 2 nights in a row. She hadn't meant to get involved, but what she saw last night had made her feel sick. Then she slipped another note under my saucer and walked away. I didn't open it until I returned to my room. The message was short. A name, digoxin. A warning, it could mimic natural heart failure symptoms in older adults. And a suggestion, get your blood tested. Soon. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at the name. Digoxin. I didn't know the drug well, but I knew enough. I remembered hearing about it years ago when one of my book club ladies had a grandson overdose on cardiac medication. It had been tragic, subtle, silent, like this. The door clicked behind me. My heart jumped. It was Darren. He smiled, too casually, said he hadn't seen me at breakfast, asked if I was feeling okay. I nodded, keeping my face steady. He commented on the breeze, the view, the food. Small talk, too much of it. I nodded along, pretending. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. He said he and Liana had been looking into new care options for me, that maybe it was time to stop running the bookstore, that a condo in Sarasota was quieter, easier, just a few hours from their place. I looked at him, not reacting. He continued, said they had already toured one on my behalf. He smiled again, wider this time, told me not to worry. They'd help handle the paperwork. I thanked him, said I'd think about it. But inside I was trembling. When he left, I locked the door and slid the chair beneath the knob, a ridiculous move on a ship full of cameras and keys, but it gave me something to do, something to control. I sat back at the desk and took out my notebook. I began to write down everything. Each meal, each symptom, each strange moment since the trip began. I dated it, timed it, marked who was present. It felt strange but necessary, like if I could see it all on paper, I could stay one step ahead. Because now I knew the truth. But they didn't know I knew, and that gave me time. Time to pretend, time to prepare, time to survive. That afternoon I walked the deck alone, keeping close to the railing and out of view. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't want to. The ocean stretched wide and flat, but I felt boxed in. There was nowhere to go on a ship, no corner where eyes didn't follow. Still, I kept walking. I needed air, and I needed space to think. Every few minutes, I felt the urge to check my pulse. My heart had settled into a strange rhythm, not painful, just inconsistent, like it couldn't decide whether to rest or run. I told myself to stay calm. Panic would only make it worse. When I returned to my cabin, there was an envelope slid under the door. It was unmarked. Inside was a folded note, same handwriting as before. No message this time, just a number. A burner phone. Room 212. A time. Midnight. I didn't know who was behind it, but something told me I had to show up. All day, I moved slowly and watched everything. At lunch, Darren brought me soup, unprompted. He made a joke about how they were testing out cruise food for their retirement someday. Liana laughed too quickly, then leaned in and wiped a napkin across my mouth like I was a child. I smiled, said thank you, and never touched the soup. I excused myself before dessert and left early. Back in my room, I double-checked the deadbolt, then sat down at the desk. I opened my notebook again and kept writing. I drew a timeline, labeled every meal, every drink. When I first started feeling symptoms, when the waitress first looked at me like she knew something I didn't write in full sentences anymore, just fragments. Words like minty, heavy, sweet but wrong, eyes, wrist, digoxin, spritzer. I rested for a few hours, or tried to. I lay on top of the bed, fully dressed, heart pacing, ears tuned to every sound in the hallway. At 11:30, I put on a coat, slipped the note in my pocket, and left without a sound. The hallway was quiet, but the ship creaked and sighed with motion. I walked slowly, not rushing. When I reached room 212, I knocked twice, paused, then once more. The door cracked open. Inside, it was dim. The only light came from a small desk lamp. The person who opened the door was the waitress. Her name tag said Maris. She didn't speak at first, just nodded and motioned for me to sit. Then she handed me a manila envelope. Inside were 3 photos. The first was of Liana, leaning over the dining table, pouring tea from a small brown bottle into a cup. The second was of Darren, standing outside what looked like a pharmacy, holding a prescription bag. The third was a shot of my cabin door, with a timestamp and the faint outline of someone slipping something beneath it. Maris said she had a friend in security, that she had seen too much to stay quiet. She wasn't supposed to have access to these stills, but she believed I was in danger. She said she had already sent digital copies to someone she trusted, in case anything happened to either of us. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just sat there and stared at the images. Pieces of a truth I already suspected, now solid on glossy paper. I thanked her. She pressed a small voice recorder into my hand and told me to keep it hidden. She said if I ever needed to record a conversation, it might be safer than trying to make a call. Then she walked me back to the hallway and disappeared into a service door without another word. When I returned to my room, I felt strangely calm, like the storm had passed. But deep down, I knew better. The real storm was just beginning, and I needed to be ready. The next day began with sun, calm waters, and the sound of clinking silverware from the breakfast deck below. From my window, it looked like any other beautiful morning. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. I didn't touch the breakfast tray they delivered. I made a note of the time it arrived and what was on it. Scrambled eggs, melon slices, a croissant, and a small glass of orange juice. I sniffed everything but tasted nothing. Then I carefully emptied the juice into the bathroom sink and washed the cup twice. I didn't trust anything that came to me without my own hands preparing it. I kept the envelope Maris gave me tucked beneath my blouse, close to my skin. The voice recorder stayed inside my left coat pocket. I checked it 3 times during the morning, just to be sure it was still working. I didn't press record yet. I was waiting for the right moment, the one that would matter. By mid-morning, the ship docked at a small harbour town. Passengers filed off in groups for excursions and shopping. Darren knocked on my door, asking if I wanted to join him and Liana for a walk along the pier. I said I was feeling tired. He offered to bring something back for me. I smiled and said maybe just a scarf or a book. After he left, I gave it 10 minutes. Then I stepped out of my room, took the side stairwell, and made my way to the lower crew deck. Maris had written a code on the inside flap of the last note, a service panel near the laundry chute. Behind it, a small locked cabinet. Inside, a prepaid phone and a folded sheet of paper. The note was simple. A name, a phone number, a lawyer. I went back upstairs and waited. The silence in the cabin felt too clean, too expectant. I pulled out my notebook again and jotted down everything I had learned so far. I added questions, too. Why now? Why this cruise? What were they planning next? Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the knock. It was Liana. She came in with a smile and a little gift bag. Said she had found something lovely in town. A silk scarf, blue and cream, delicate as air. I thanked her. She placed the bag on the chair and sat across from me. Her tone was light, but her eyes were fixed. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was doing better. She nodded, crossed her legs, and leaned in a little closer. Said that she and Darren had been talking, and they both felt it might be time to start thinking long-term. They wanted to help with everything: medical care, legal affairs, maybe even transferring some of the house documents in advance, just to be safe. My fingers curled tight around the edge of my sweater. I kept my face still. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small manila envelope. Said it was just a few forms. Nothing final. Just drafts. She didn't pressure. She just laid it on the table between us, like it was nothing more than cruise reading material. I told her I'd take a look after dinner. She smiled again, stood up, and said to rest as much as I needed. Then she walked out without another word. The envelope sat untouched for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, I dressed carefully, the same cardigan, the voice recorder in place. I slipped the envelope she had left me into my tote, along with my notebook and Maris's photos. If anything went wrong, I needed it all with me. At dinner, Darren greeted me with a glass of wine already poured. I accepted it with a nod and placed it directly on the tablecloth without drinking. They were watching. I could feel it. But what they didn't know was that I was finally watching back, and I had already started to record. That night, the dining room was quieter than usual. A few passengers had gotten off at the last port and hadn't returned. The rest sat scattered, their conversations soft, silverware clinking gently against porcelain. My table was set for 3. Darren sat across from me, swirling his wine. Liana arrived late, cheeks flushed, apologizing with a smile as she slid into her seat. I noticed the waiter set down the tea without asking. Not just for me, but only for me. A delicate white cup with a gold rim, a pot with a cloth-wrapped handle. Liana's hand hovered close to it, but she didn't pour. She waited. I leaned back and folded my napkin across my lap. My heart didn't race. Not anymore. There was something steadier inside me now. Not anger, not even fear. Just a clear knowing. I had already slipped the voice recorder into the side pocket of my cardigan. It was running. Darren launched into a story about their investment meeting next week. He said they might have to cut their trip short. Liana chimed in that the timing was unfortunate, but necessary. Something about an urgent opportunity they couldn't miss. I nodded, pretending to listen, though I had heard enough to understand what they were trying to lay out. They were planting the idea of an early departure, a clean exit. At one point, Liana picked up the teapot and poured for me. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but her voice was gentle, said it would help with sleep. I cupped the warm mug in my hands and held it there. I didn't drink. Instead, I asked them about the envelope, the one she had left earlier. Darren said it was just estate planning, that it would be easier to handle now than wait until things became complicated. Liana added that they didn't want to burden me with stress, that they wanted to give me peace. I told them I appreciated the thought, that I would consider it. I smiled. I was calm. The recorder was still running. Later that evening, I returned to my cabin and locked the door. I took out the envelope again and opened it fully for the first time. Inside were preliminary transfer papers, power of attorney, property documents, bank authorization forms, all unsigned, but with sticky notes marking the places I would need to initial. The language was clear enough for anyone to understand. It granted Darren control over my financial accounts. It allowed him to make medical decisions on my behalf. And it named Liana as my emergency contact for all legal correspondence. I flipped to the last page. A letter, typed, brief, and addressed to my longtime attorney back in Maryland. It read like a notification that I had chosen to begin consolidating my assets under Darren's care, that I was willingly simplifying my estate. I sat still for a long time. Then I placed everything back into the envelope and stored it beneath the lining of my suitcase. I didn't tear it up. I didn't scribble on it. I kept it, untouched, because I needed it. Just after midnight, I returned to the crew deck again. Maris met me near the service stairs. She handed me a flash drive and whispered that her friend in security had managed to copy some camera footage. It wasn't perfect, she said. A few angles were missing, but it showed enough. Liana, in the hallway, slipping something under my door. Darren in the lounge, handing a waiter a folded note that matched the handwriting from one of the first messages I received. More images of the pharmacy bag. One blurry shot of a brown bottle half tucked in Liana's purse. I didn't thank her this time. I just nodded. Back in my room, I hid the flash drive deep in my toiletries bag, beneath the cotton pads and spare toothbrushes. I sat at the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and listened to the quiet hum of the ship pushing forward into the dark. There was no turning back now. Whatever came next, I was ready to meet it with both eyes open. The morning after I received the flash drive, the ocean was calm, almost glassy. A stillness had settled across the ship, but inside me, everything had sharpened. There was no more confusion, no more benefit of the doubt. I had evidence, I had a name, I had a timeline, and now I had a plan. I dressed with care that day. A navy blouse with long sleeves to cover the voice recorder, slacks with deep pockets to hold the drive and the photos. I packed my tote bag neatly with everything Maris had passed to me. Then I added something extra. The draft papers Darren and Liana had prepared. I knew they wouldn't expect me to bring those. Mid-morning, I made my way to the reception deck, where guests could schedule meetings with ship staff. I asked if the onboard legal liaison was available. A young officer named Givens appeared 10 minutes later, leading me into a private conference room tucked behind the administrative hallway. He was polite, formal, and just the right amount of skeptical. I laid out the flash drive, the photos, the notes, and the unsigned documents. I didn't try to dramatize. I explained plainly. I told him I believed I had been drugged over the past several days, that 2 passengers, my son and daughter-in-law, had attempted to manipulate my health and mental state for legal control of my estate. I did not cry. I did not shake. I simply told him the truth. He reviewed the materials without interrupting. Then he asked for permission to take the flash drive to the ship's security chief. I agreed. He also offered to send a private message to my attorney in Maryland. I gave him the name and number. He said he'd use the ship's secure satellite line. After the meeting, I didn't return to my room. I found a quiet corner in the library and waited. By lunchtime, Darren appeared beside me, smiling, said he had been looking all over for me, asked if I wanted to eat with them out on the upper deck. I stood and followed him. At the table, Liana poured iced tea from a chilled carafe. She was wearing a soft pink dress and her lipstick matched her earrings. She looked rested, relaxed. Her eyes, though, flicked toward my tote bag once or twice. We made it halfway through the meal before the shift happened. A crew member walked over, not someone I had seen before. He asked Darren and Liana to come with him. Said the captain requested a short conversation. Nothing urgent, just protocol. Their smiles twitched for a moment, but they stood. Darren touched my shoulder lightly and said he'd be right back. I watched them walk away. I didn't move. I sat there and finished my tea, the one I poured myself. The breeze picked up, and I pulled my sweater a little tighter around my shoulders. 30 minutes later, Officer Givens returned to my table. He asked if we could speak again. This time, he led me to a different room. It was colder, more official. He said the ship's medical officer had reviewed the surveillance footage and corroborated what the photos suggested. The prescription bag, the tea, the repeated attempts to isolate me. It wasn't conclusive, but it was suspicious enough. Givens said Darren and Liana were being questioned separately. They weren't under arrest, but they had been asked to remain in their cabins until the ship docked at the next port. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him not yet. First, I needed to talk to my lawyer. I needed to get home. He nodded. That evening, dinner felt different. I sat alone, by choice. Maris passed by once, refilling water glasses. Our eyes met for half a second, and she gave the slightest nod. Nothing more. Back in my room, I finally slept. Deep, uninterrupted sleep. The storm had cracked open, but there was still more to come. I could feel it. And this time, I wasn't waiting to be rescued. The next morning, the ship docked at the final port before returning to Maryland. The sky was overcast, heavy with the kind of stillness that felt like it was waiting for something to break. I stood on the upper deck in a grey windbreaker, watching passengers step off with their luggage and plastic souvenirs. I didn't carry anything with me but my tote bag, zipped shut, with the envelope still inside. I had already spoken to my attorney the night before. The call was brief but sharp. She confirmed what I had suspected. Darren had contacted her office 2 weeks earlier, requesting copies of my trust documents and a durable power of attorney form. He hadn't said I was ill. He had said I was aging quickly, slipping. He had also asked whether the trust could be amended without my physical presence if she had his legal authority. I didn't cry when I heard that. Not then. At 10:30 sharp, I walked to the main lounge where the cruise director was holding a farewell reception. Most passengers came for mimosas and last photos. I came for something else. I had asked the captain, through Officer Givens, for 15 minutes. I told them I wanted to make a personal announcement before disembarking. Nothing dramatic, just a gesture to thank the staff and recognize someone who had shown quiet integrity. They agreed. The microphone felt too light in my hand. I stood in front of the crowd in the lounge, my palms dry, my shoulders steady. I began by thanking the staff. Then I said something about the way this journey had reminded me that people show their true nature not in grand gestures, but in how they move when they think no one is watching. I spoke slowly, not naming names, but making it clear that someone among us had chosen silence when it would have been safer. Someone had chosen truth. Then I called Maris to the front. She froze. She didn't expect it. I saw her hesitate near the espresso machine, then step forward, confused. I smiled at her and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a scholarship certificate. What no one on that ship knew, what not even Maris knew, was that I had made some calls of my own before boarding. There's a small foundation my late husband and I had quietly supported for years, designed to fund continuing education for underrepresented women in science and healthcare. I had contacted them 2 nights ago, explained the situation, asked if a late cycle application could be considered. They agreed. The scholarship covered her final year of tuition and living expenses. Her reaction was quiet. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her hands trembled when she hugged me. Then she walked away quickly, blending back into the staff like mist. I stepped down from the platform. There was light applause. But I wasn't looking at the guests. I was watching Darren and Liana. They stood near the back wall, their faces unreadable. Darren had his arms crossed. Liana clutched her purse tightly against her side. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Later that afternoon, I met with Officer Givens one final time. I gave him the original envelope, the recorded conversations, and the flash drive. I told him I had decided not to press charges, not yet, but I asked that a report be filed and forwarded to my attorney. I also gave him a copy of a letter I had written, addressed to Darren and Liana. I didn't plan to hand it to them myself. I didn't need to. My silence would speak louder. That night, I slept in a small inn overlooking the water. No motion beneath my feet, no footsteps outside my door. Just the quiet rhythm of my own breath, steady and mine. In the dark, I reached for the bedside table, pulled my notebook from my bag, and tore out every page with their names on it. I didn't burn them. I folded them into quarters and placed them in the drawer, then closed it slowly. Let them stay there. I was already somewhere else. 3 weeks after I stepped off that ship, I found myself standing inside my attorney's office again, the same office where Richard and I had first signed our wills, back when we were both still wearing matching glasses and laughing about living to 90. The sun cut across the carpet in warm squares. The smell of old leather and paper grounded me. Across the desk, my attorney, Janice, slid over a stack of updated documents, not rushed, not emotional, just careful, clean, thought through. I had asked her to start fresh. Every previous designation that named Darren or Liana was removed. Their names no longer appeared anywhere. Not on my healthcare proxy. Not on the deed to the house. Not in the charitable trust Richard and I had built for future literacy programs. The bookstore I had run for 32 years would pass into the hands of a community foundation after I was gone. They would keep it open, keep the reading nights, keep the shelves full of poetry and dust and gentle voices. I initialed every page with a steady hand. Janice offered to file a police report again, given the additional evidence she had now received from the cruise line. I told her no, not yet. But I asked her to keep it all, every photo, every audio file, every document, in secure storage. I wanted it available if ever needed. But I didn't want my life to become about chasing them. That wasn't my story anymore. After I left the office, I stopped by the bookstore. Not to work, just to sit. The new assistant manager, Cora, was already shelving the summer books and setting up flyers for a local author night. She waved from behind the counter and I waved back. I sat in the corner armchair, the one with the ripped arm that I never wanted to reupholster because the tear reminded me of Richard's clumsy reach for a dropped pen during our second tax season. A woman came in, maybe in her 50s. She browsed quietly, bought a memoir, then turned and looked at me. She said she recognized me, said she had been on that same cruise, said she remembered the way I stood during that speech in the lounge. She didn't ask questions. She just placed her hand over her heart and said she had never forgotten it. Then she left. I stayed in the chair for a while. Let the quiet settle. Let the smell of books do its work. That night, back at home, I stood in the kitchen and made a pot of mint tea. The real kind. No sweetener, no syrup, no strange aftertaste. Just steeped leaves and hot water. I sat at the table, wrapped in a quilt, and listened to the stillness of the house. It was mine again, fully. I had changed the locks the day after I returned, hired a company to install cameras around the perimeter. Nothing aggressive, just precaution. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest neighbor. Some nights, I still woke up around 3, heart racing. I would lie there in the dark, listening to nothing. But slowly, even that began to fade. I never returned Darren's last message. A voicemail left the day after the cruise ended. His voice low, tired, saying he was sorry if things had felt confusing, that they had only wanted what was best for me, that they hoped I would understand in time. I deleted it without playing it a second time. In the back of my closet, beneath a storage bin full of winter scarves, I kept a copy of the cruise manifest, printed, marked, highlighted, with my name circled, and a short note beneath it in my own handwriting. You survived, you remembered, you rebuilt, and still, you are here. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it washed everything in soft gold. The bookstore's front windows bloomed with light. Cora had moved the poetry shelf closer to the door, and every morning the smell of ink and sun made the place feel like it was breathing. I found myself walking more, not for exercise, not for any particular goal, just to feel my feet steady against the sidewalk. Some days, I wandered past the old cafe Richard and I used to visit every Sunday morning. They had changed owners twice since then, but the striped awning remained, faded and familiar. One Thursday morning, I received a large envelope in the mail, heavy, official. I recognized the return address. It was from Darren and Liana's attorney. Inside, there was a letter, polished, vague. They stated they intended to challenge the trust revisions I had made. They claimed undue influence, suggested I had been manipulated during the cruise, that perhaps someone had coerced me into rewriting my documents under stress. There were no accusations, just veiled implications. At the bottom was a note that their attorney recommended mediation before escalation. I didn't feel shaken. I called Janice that afternoon. She laughed, not unkindly, but with the sort of exhale that only comes from having seen too much. She told me not to worry, that we had everything in place. Documentation, testimony, the cruise files, the letter Darren himself had drafted, the one he never realized I kept. Still, I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because some griefs return, even after you think you've buried them. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, and for the first time since returning, I began a new page. I didn't write about betrayal. I didn't list symptoms or track time. I wrote about resilience. I wrote about the moment I chose not to drink the tea. The moment I stepped into that conference room on the ship, hands steady, spine straight. The moment I saw Maris fade back into the crowd, her shoulders just a little taller. These were the things I needed to remember, not the threats, not the documents, not the voicemail I deleted, but the choice to stand, quietly, completely. The legal proceedings didn't last long. Janice responded with a letter of her own. Attached were the full cruise investigation reports, transcripts from the ship's staff, photographs, and voice recordings. She reminded their attorney that every signature in the revised estate plan had been notarized, each update done with clarity and legal integrity. 3 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. Inside was a withdrawal statement. Darren and Liana had dropped their claim. No explanation, just 2 lines typed by their lawyer and a final word, resolved. I placed the letter in a folder labeled final. I didn't add it to the fireproof safe. I didn't need to. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at the bookstore. Nothing extravagant. Just a few neighbors, some retired teachers, and Maris. She had driven in from campus, her shoulders stronger, her voice firmer. She brought me a small glass jar of loose tea leaves, organic peppermint and lemon balm. The tag said, safe and hers. We sat in the back corner, sipping tea that tasted of real citrus and comfort. And for the first time in months, I let myself exhale completely. The following autumn, the trees on my street turned a burnt orange that clung to the branches longer than usual. I took morning walks wrapped in a wool coat, the same one I had worn on the cruise, only now it carried the scent of dry leaves and old books. Life didn't return to how it was before. It became something else, not smaller, not quieter, just clearer. I donated half the contents of my house, kept only what held weight in my hands or meaning in my heart. I repainted the kitchen walls. I stopped setting the table for 3. I even took down the family portrait above the fireplace and replaced it with a framed quote I copied in longhand on heavy paper. It said, "I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to do after." Cora helped me digitize the bookstore inventory. We started hosting poetry nights again, sometimes with more candles than guests. But the ones who came stayed late, and they listened. People who had never spoken much began reading aloud. Voices cracked, smiles softened. Something was being rebuilt there, slowly. Maris wrote to me once a month. Her emails were short, filled with updates about exams and late-night shifts at the hospital lab. In one of them, she told me she had changed her thesis topic. Now she was researching the long-term metabolic impact of low-dose exposure to certain cardiac medications. She ended that note with a line that said, "I never pour tea for anyone without watching their eyes." I replied, "I'm proud of you." I meant it. Darren and Liana didn't reach out again. I heard through someone at the bank that they had moved. A smaller town, quieter. I wondered once if they looked at each other differently now, if what they'd done had hardened them or broken something permanent between them. But then I folded that thought up and let it go. I had no room left for imagining lives that chose to leave mine. By winter, the rhythm of my days felt settled. I woke up without dread. I read the mail without scanning for threats. And one evening, sitting by the window, I opened my notebook again and wrote just one sentence. "You outlived the poison. Now live like you never drank it." The world didn't need to know everything I endured, but I needed to remember the woman I became in the middle of it. A woman who once sat in a dining room full of smiling faces and chose with a steady hand not to drink. That choice saved more than my life. It returned me to myself. If you've ever found yourself quietly watching the people around you, wondering what their smiles might hide, then you're not alone. Sometimes survival isn't loud. It's one small choice at a time. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever chosen silence over chaos or walked away from something heavy, this space is for you too. You're seen here. Seen. You're not forgotten.